Critical Notices Number 1, The Revolution Beyond Academia and Into the Next Phase. Welcome to Critical Notices. Issue number 1 here will explain the relationship between knowledge, technology, and social change through paradigms and stages and methods of knowledge creation and distribution. Specifically, it will address the revolutionary nature of the changes that are upon us, the effect it has had on certain powerful institutions as well. The Center for Syncretic Studies is self-conscious of this process, and it informs our work. To frame all this, we will begin by talking briefly about our work and what it has required that we be free to do. That means that first we have to introduce our nominal subject in an unorthodox way. That is so that the center's intimate subjective relationship with the process we are describing in more objective terminology can be rightly appreciated. In order to fulfill our work, we have had to engage in a multifaceted strategy. Once it's understood what we have done, what we are accused of doing, the nature of our work will become more clear. We have come under tremendous scrutiny from powerful private and governmental institutions. We have been perhaps misunderstood, but clearly defamed, and our work has been investigated by intelligence agencies, public and private, which have reported to the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee in connection with the Mueller investigation. This is because our history deals with the Media Intelligence Hub, accusations that we have assisted or been assisted by foreign countries or related agencies, engaged in information war, infiltration, enabled the rise of counter-hegemonic movements, been involved in narrative creation, and our work was believed by some within these institutions to be of some inconvenience to however they have constructed and understood their own goals. Until now, we have not really made explaining our work the point of our work, but it's important to communicate directly to the public what we are doing, what we are about, given the efforts at misinformation that the above-mentioned institutions have engaged in order to derail our work. This means we will have to explain to the public what we are doing in our own words, so that the false narrative does not persist as the only one. We will explain this work more clearly in coming presentations. But first, while we know our supporters and the public alike need to understand what we first encountered, which framed a lot of the practical side of the application of our work, it's important that we understand one of the underlying or framing ideas that our work is based in. When we talk about our mission and our goals in the next presentation, number 2, then the nature of the work we are better known for will become more apparent. What was the challenge we faced? When the center was founded in 2013, the stability of the unipolar order and its transatlanticism was taken for granted by most Western audiences. We use the term audience quite intentionally. Transatlanticism is an extremely specific phenomenon, and its decline does not mean that the US and Europe will see any real deterioration of relations if their respective leadership behave rationally and can cope with the major changes occurring in the world today. Critical Notices 1, to be clear, asks these questions. What is the relationship between information distribution systems like Internet 2.0 on the one hand and formalized knowledge in general on the other? How does this parallel the invention of the printing press 500 years ago? And how has that both necessitated and made possible the development of the legacy academic institutions whose value and predominance are in decline and are indeed waning? This hardly means that they are today irrelevant, not by any stretch. Today, we will strive to answer these. To understand the nature of our work on one critical level is to understand the nature of systems of knowledge creation and distribution under the present technological conditions of what many call late capitalism. What we will also answer in this is why the Internet in general, and Internet 2.0 and beyond in particular, is revolutionary. It is not only revolutionary in terms of recent history, but is the most revolutionary change to information in the past 500 years. What about other changes in the past 500 years? Other changes in the past 500 years were incremental, but based within the paradigm of the printing press and printed knowledge. Radio and television are but precursors to the new paradigm we are on the precipice of, in the same way that the earliest kinds of printing presses prior to the Gutenberg machine were still very limited in their use and application. And so naturally, the present methods of social control, its present organs, its present tools through the corporate and governmental structures will inherently want to try to curtail and control the information revolution we are upon. In this presentation, we will also explain why this is the case. Internet 2.0 and beyond is to the coming paradigm what the introduction of the printing press was to the Renaissance and the early modern paradigm. It is a well-known phenomenon that it is often not until much after the fact that the critical turning points within historical processes were understood and dated. It is possible that we have already left the modern paradigm, but we would absolutely include postmodernity as not a whole stage after modernity, but as the very end of modernity, or the segue between modernity and whatever we are entering into or have just entered. But the logical sequence that evolved, even though things changed and continue to change, were still within the broader printing press paradigm. It is that paradigm that made universities, the academies, both possible and necessary. The explosion of literacy and the new university system from the 16th and 17th century would have to also be contained. What we really want to communicate is that these had to be utilized in a predictable manner, contained and controlled in that way. And so the first professors of the academy had to come out of the clergy. And likewise, the internet's education systems, as in those through YouTube and others, are now at a stage where not only learning, but certification will come from new established and less centralized institutions and centers doing the new form of learning and teaching through the internet. Again, this is a process. We already have distance learning and online courses, but these are still associated with the old institutions, just as the first professors of the then new academies, now old institutions, had their certifications through the church and its own centers of learning. To make this simple and clear enough, it is useful to use Foucauldian, Kuhnian, Heideggerian, Baudrillardian, and Marxian analytic framework in terms of understanding the technological effects on culture, knowledge creation, and distribution. In short, we will have to consider the last 1,000 years of knowledge creation and distribution. Is it really possible to cover 1,000 years here? No. Of course, explanations are the map and not the terrain itself, and we're going to have to simplify at the risk of leaving much out. But in brief, we can divide the last 1,000 years of information and knowledge creation and distribution into several periods. The main thesis here is this. The printing press developed and put into wide use after the 15th century created the entire framework for the post-medieval system of information creation and distribution. It created what we now call modernity. So to explain our thesis, and what is one of the central ideas that the Center for Syncretic Studies works on, is that knowledge information and distribution can be divided historically, and these create larger epistemes or paradigms. We can separate information from knowledge, in that information doesn't speak for itself, whereas knowledge implies a narrative or meaning or utility attached to the information. Naturally, we have to define what we mean by knowledge creation and distribution. In academic terms, under the present paradigm, which is quickly becoming the former paradigm, knowledge creation took place in a controlled process known as bibliogenesis. This refers to a process controlled by the legacy learning institutions, which were founded primarily in the 16th through 19th centuries. The real difference occurs between the medieval period and the Renaissance. The rest can be said to be the effects of the Renaissance in Europe, as the changes it compelled moved farther north. In turn, this was all made possible by the printing press, which arrived after the first 4 decades of the 15th century and is normally ascribed to being the Gutenberg press. Some systems, and more popularly so, use the word science when describing research in the humanities. Even though very different approaches to knowledge are used, they have very different epistemic framings. The humanities increasingly attempts to mimic or imitate the certitude and empirical nature of the hard sciences, but because the humanities are inherently subjective, the result is inherently authoritarian it may indeed work against broader debates about what knowledge is or ought to consist of. At the same time, and perhaps in a contradictory way, efforts to make the humanities more rigorous, consistent, and use tools and methods similar to or reminiscent of the hard sciences, such as semiotic charts, diagrams, statistics, most similar and most different systems analysis, are also justified and required. The problem here arises in the way that capital T truth content of the discoveries or claims is presented. These in fact rely not on empirical or observable evidence, but on the power relationship that the institution making the claims has with society on the whole. Hence, they can present a problem of abuse of power. But overall, what we can see is that there have been attempts to standardize the rigor and standardize the epistemic tools, and this has had some good outcomes and has also imposed some limitations. And more to the point, it has made interdisciplinarity more possible and opened doors which in turn make it more necessary. Again, like with most of the processes described here, in terms of which came first, it is a chicken or the egg sort of question. So, to understand the process that societies have taken up to create and distribute knowledge, there are several factors to consider. The first is that these are divided based on the kind of resources required to produce knowledge, through which multiple stages, and until recently, these favored centralization and was resource intensive in terms of societies of scale and the mass coordinative efforts required towards those ends. The other, and critically important, is that technologies do not evolve blindly, and while they are limited by the scope of knowledge at a given time and place, and have an upward limitation based upon the literature and the state of bibliogenesis in a given time and place, they must also be consciously controlled to develop a certain way, so that their immediate and foreseeable effects are not destabilizing to the societies which organize these and create these and allocate resources for them. This has historically created a problem, because new discoveries and leaps in knowledge, or more to the point today, leaps in the process of knowledge creation, pose the very serious and real challenge of destabilizing these societies. But are we oversimplifying the concept of society to the detriment of understanding the real mechanisms we are concerned with? Yes. The concept of society itself is often misframed or misunderstood. Societies are not monolithic and in fact are composed of groups who interact with society in different ways. We might call these interest groups power groups or classes in society. They have different sorts of power, and some may be more disempowered than others. These may be social or economic classes as such. At any rate, leaps or significant changes in the process of knowledge creation does not pose a serious threat or challenge to all components, that is to say, all the interest groups in a society. The old adage that knowledge is power must be understood in this context. That means that significant changes in the process of knowledge creation can change the balance of power, that is, which groups hold and maintain it. It is generally observable that the main power group in a society that regulates and metabolizes the social processes and in general terms governs that society has an ipso facto conservative relationship with knowledge and information. This is because new knowledge and information leads to, just as much as it is produced by, new technologies. The governing power group in a society has a specific and temporally confined relationship with specific technologies. Societies of scale are bureaucratic in nature and are not individuals capable of making snap judgments, determinations, and changes. This means that the governing power tends to try to slow down and limit new knowledge and information and the technologies that it will create. It must slow it down and limit it until it can get the gears of its own techno-bureaucratic machine moving towards the process of metabolizing and assimilating the new knowledge, to understand how it can be used and to keep others from using it and getting ahead of the power group. The power group does not want to be usurped by those who get to the information first, so they have a strong reason to use that information. It just takes these large-scale institutions more time to wrap their heads around what's going on. Understanding this is key to understanding the process at play over the past 1,000 years. In the medieval period, knowledge was produced and distributed by the church. The reasons for this are deep and reach back into classical antiquity and the development of church and state institutions coming out of the rise of Christianity in Europe and Islam in the Middle East. But that situation is a given that we begin with when we look at Europe 1,000 years ago. Literacy was confined to three classes: the church, the state's bureaucracy, and the rulers themselves of noble families with inherited titles. However, most, if not all, teaching was done through the church. Whether their students would go on to become part of the church or bureaucrats was another question, and of course the nobility consisted of inherited titles for the most part, even though titles could be acquired through various methods, through war, through loyalty, and so on. The nobility would place its members in the church as well. Moreover, the bureaucracy of the state could often be composed of the clergy, and all of the bureaucrats were educated through the church by the clergy. Hence, the church and state were intertwined at many levels. Literacy and bibliogenesis were regulated then ultimately by the church. But what is critical here for the discourse is the technological component. Books had to be written by hand, and so a whole part of the clergy's own bureaucracy was dedicated to text creation and manual reproduction. Think of the thousands of monks committing thousands of hours of labor to produce text sufficient to match the needs of growing bureaucracies as techno-scientific governmental processes increased through the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance and Reformation of modernity. There were various ways of producing texts in scale, besides many monks spending many hours doing it by hand, such as by plates or cylinder scrolls as used in the East. Stone templates were used also to create rubbings, but the methods of producing paper and the costs involved in such operations was significant. The fact that Greek and Hebrew, for example, originally shared the same alphabet, but that one is the mirror image of the other, are written right to left and left to right respectively, may be a product of the cylinder scroll method being used in Chaldean, Babylonian, Levantine civilization, which were then rolled over ink and would produce a mirror image. However, if using a rubbings method, the rubbing would produce the original as appeared on the cylinder or plate. And so rubbings produce the same image as the original template, whereas rolls are imprints and produce a mirror image. So the church had gone through various processes and had to also, as explained, hold back certain knowledge, or had to metabolize knowledge, particularly pre-Christian, Southern European, and Mediterranean knowledge that was maintained in the East and was understood there through the prism of Islam. And so those pre-Christian texts, and more to the point, the profound directions they were pointing to and would ultimately lead, had to be Christianized, and their distribution was limited both by the relative low number of people who could understand them in terms of both literacy and raw numbers and in terms of the status of a culture of interest in these, and by the very slow and arduous methods that these texts would be produced. Again, truly critical here is the very slow and arduous methods that these texts were produced, both because they had to be written by hand and because the knowledge had to be metabolized by the church in a way that reinforced the narrative and the church had been based upon for some centuries, and had to introduce knowledge in the medieval period in a way at least passably consistent with the narrative it had been telling for generations upon generations before. So the technological limitations are very important to underscore, as well as the contradiction that the power elite faced. It needed to utilize new information and utilize it before other potential power groups could utilize this. It needed to slow down the process of new information production and distribution, even though this also had a hard-coded limitation based on the limited technology of production, the lack of printing presses, and that will figure prominently into how we will explain this to you next. But it also had to process this information internally before it could incorporate this into its public teaching, and it had to figure out which things would remain internal, placed to the side, digested more slowly, or rejected altogether before it could make other parts of knowledge more public. Those parts of knowledge that had to remain internal, because they were contradictory, they were both true but also destabilizing. This is the origin of occult or esoteric knowledge that power groups maintain. It is not, as is often taught wrongly in the academy, those parts of knowledge that were left behind in the course of time. There is a part of esoteric or occult knowledge that had its truth content outside of technological application, and which may have ultimately been dead ends and were cast aside. But this is neither the real nature nor origin of occult or esoteric knowledge held or maintained within the church and the old system of knowledge creation and distribution, and that will continue to be the case as time moves forward into the modern period and the rise of academies. Typically, the rise of the Gutenberg machine is cited as the critical invention which made the printing press revolution possible. There had been some other types of presses which preceded it, but the movable type and mass production of the machine itself would lead to millions of copies of books in the codex style to be printed. These were books of knowledge beyond that which the church might have wanted to be printed in such high volume for many reasons. The printing press spread throughout Europe, and both reflected and magnified technological changes in Europe. These reflected the magnified cultural changes in Europe and significantly changed the near monopoly on information that the church had in the medieval period. Replacing the church then would be the academy. This did not make the church irrelevant and would not for another century or two more in terms of accreditation for teaching at academies or for having been taught there. While there was a rise of secular humanism in Renaissance Italy, this didn't just grow up outside of the church, but also within it. This leads to understanding both the Inquisition and the Reformation. For the Inquisition and Counter-Reformation, as well as the Reformation itself, would not have been possible or necessary if not for the problems and promises posed by the printing press revolution. And that somewhat parallels the situation that we are in today, with the tremendous increase of repression through the mechanisms of the present paradigm of modernity as it pushes to fight back and to slow down the emergent new paradigm that we are approaching. From what we have understood already, we would be belaboring the point now to go back and point how specifically the new system of knowledge creation also had to be controlled and utilized, and its effects made predictable. It works essentially the same as with the church system, but the tempo or pace of change is much more in the early modern period thanks to the printing press and the academies. In looking at our previous set of questions, we posed that it may be difficult to know where we stand historically. The center would propose that we cannot be said to have entered the next phase until the monopoly-driven censorship that YouTube allows and enforces is overturned. For example, if the institutions of the medieval paradigm, such as the church, the nobility, and the state bureaucracy, had remained solely in control of the printing press, then texts which would come to overturn that historical period would never have been permitted to have been printed, or perhaps printed in a limited manner, and that also explains, by and large, the Counter-Reformation and Inquisition. By limited, we can say clearly that if there is a greater demand than is represented in the publications, and that these are clearly for power or political reasons relating to censorship, then it is limited in that sense. And today, the corporation is like the nobility, the academy like the church, and the state remains more or less as such, though its legitimating ideology reflects the present paradigm. In the past, there were clear and significant contests of power, political clashes, a fight to occupy more space on the part of the emerging paradigm, departing the medieval period. And this process is also what is meant by revolutionary, for the old social order, its methods of creation and distribution, its legitimating ideology, were all overturned in the end, for better or worse. While it is true that this produced yet another system with another hierarchy and new institutions who in turn had their own vested interests in forms of control and domination, there is also no doubt that human knowledge and the human experience changed in some significant way. Whether these changes were progress, unless progress has a circular definition, or more to the point, whether these changes were ultimately for the good, is a value judgment. There are more complex questions which we will want to answer in coming episodes, as the very question of progress itself features prominently in the work of the center. But what is critical is the freedom to ask questions, the freedom to associate with others asking questions, the freedom to be wrong, the freedom to pursue social policies whose rationale or consequences may lay outside of the dominant or prevailing paradigm. What is critical is that the technologies that already exist can be used by people freely associating, and that the success or failure of these associations be based on the relevance their work has to the public at large, as determined by the public at large and their interest in it, and not as the result of the prevailing power structures repressing them. Today, this repression takes the form of delisting, demonetization, shadow bans, and whole channels being erased. The system is attempting to plug holes into the cracks of the dam, but the rising tide of the coming paradigm is already predictive of what is upon us. And here's a final and last thing to consider on that point. The present academic system can no longer manage all of the increasing specializations. It cannot afford to finance them, nor can it create the kinds of generalists needed to make the specializations coherent to each other towards practical implementation or utility. Because of the overall declining rate of profit, or law of diminishing returns, which characterizes the present logic of the economic system of this paradigm, which many call late capitalism, investments in new technologies will necessarily yield less returns. In speaking to our colleagues, we have found something pretty universally expressed at the conferences they attend relating to their fields. Funding sources from legacy institutions and governments are drying up. They are urging experts, writers, and researchers to create an online presence to engage directly with the public. On the one hand, they have been reluctant to criticize the major tech and social media firms for their censorship in any organized or noticeable way. On the other hand, they realize that they can no longer justify the expenditures required to further the fields of knowledge for people who they themselves have educated and set up for career paths. Then there is the phenomenon of experts educated almost entirely by the internet, and whose knowledge parallels or surpasses that which has come out of the legacy academic institutions. While there are some major contradictions here, they are not irresolvable ones. There are really no surprises or twists in this process if we, again, look back at the relationship that the church once had with the first academies and universities. Just as humanists and the clergy rose side by side in the creation of the late Renaissance academies and institutions that would become universities, we should expect the new experts and the old type of experts coming from the legacy institutions to arise side by side in this new system of knowledge creation and distribution. The Center for Syncretic Studies, then, is based on the new systems of knowledge creation and distribution made possible by the internet. Just as with the clergy and the first academies and universities, our researchers and the advisors of our journal, and oversight of components of our work in general, are people who come out of the modern academy itself. But the center reaches beyond the modern academy, for all the above reasons explained in the evolution of knowledge creation and distribution systems. While our work is public, the first work we did was to spread information using the internet in order to reduce geopolitical tensions and to reduce and prevent war. The very exciting part of our work took us out of using Internet 2.0, and generally our work was textual in nature for the general public, but significantly it was our development of a daily online newspaper aimed at preparing Western Anglophone audiences for the now arrived age of multipolarity. Our materials were primarily Internet 1.0, text, but we advised non-governmental institutions from around the world on how to communicate with Anglophone, specifically American audiences, to express to them and inform them of the great changes afoot. These changes are not only represented by great shifts of geopolitical power in the world, away from hegemonic monopolarity of the US with the EU as a junior partner, but rather a multipolar world which sees the increase of independence of the EU from the US, but also the rise of India, of China, of Eurasia, of Latin America, and Africa as independent civilizational spheres, each with their own self-determination and power to create and recreate their own cultures. Whether one considers this part of globalization or multipolarization, or whether one sees these as not mutually exclusive processes, is in some ways semantic. The point is that these civilizational spheres have tremendously increased agency, and this by and large is perhaps a phase of globalization that was overlooked or it could represent some other trajectory altogether, with globalization as it was understood in the literature in the 1980s and through the first decade of the 21st century. That may be put to the side and may have ultimately been proven to be untrue. But this is not so much a model that is being taught at the academies for reasons we have explained, to the extent that some academies are catching up with the information now broadly understood by a growing number of newly educated and informed demographics from the internet, on the internet. It is akin to the church eventually recognizing the independently arrived at scientific findings of the independent from the church academies. That said, numerous university professors and some institutions formally themselves have been recording and uploading more lectures online. However, much of the information they are distributing is based on the old model of universities, that is, the kind of information approved by those institutions. And this happens and occurs within a context of a decrease of academic freedom, where professors and their adjuncts today have much less agency to express their real views. And this has come at a great cost to human knowledge in general. So while this represents the shifts going on, it is far from the realization of the shift. It lacks not only in interdisciplinarity, but often fails to account for new findings and new research being carried out in other countries which have differing assumptions and diverse literature, where the state of the literature is different, sometimes and even often richer, and often fails to take seriously the work of independent researchers. It is this latter category of independent researchers that is the revolution afoot. In that sense, the Center also represents a collective of such researchers. Concretely, because the Center was involved in working with BRICS countries on immediate projects, we have been late to engage with Internet 2.0, primarily through YouTube, but we will also back up on other sites for obvious reasons. However, it has been fantastic to see countless YouTube channels pop up in the last 5 years or so who have really fulfilled our best predictions and have created excellent educational materials, presented them very professionally. Some rely on more modern forms of information, making them useful, but still very much a direct product of the paradigm we are now exiting. Nevertheless, is there a problem here? Yes, insofar as people are still engaging with the new information as human screens, as an audience, as content consumers, but the direct engagement with the world of man in its real world and simulacrum or hyperreal form is what is necessary to ensure that the phase we are entering does not lead to the further enslavement or obliteration of mankind as we know it. We would even propose that it is selfish, but more to the point self-defeating, nihilist, and both individually and collectively suicidal to approach the coming changes in a passive way. Because things will change, but the question remains whether they will change for you or against you. That is why we rely on your active support. We cannot express enough the interconnectedness of the following phenomenon: the revolution in knowledge creation processes made possible by the internet, the rise of new nodes of knowledge distribution increasingly attractive and popular due to Internet 2.0, the importance of access that formerly divided demographics now have to each other, and that individuals have to each other, to conduct independent research from varying parts of the world, combining and syncretizing previously unknown or even specifically adverse schools of thought based often in very different literature. The social media and digital tech industries pushing back against free expression, free association, and the development of human knowledge which, by humanist standards, also constitutes a pushback against the development of science or the sciences. Finally, all these processes mirror the decline of monopolarity in the world, often characterized by some as the US empire. Now, our next videos in the Critical Notices series will discuss and explain more about our work, what we are, what our aims are, what we are about. Then we will begin to disclose what we have done since 2013. The point of this series is not to talk too much about our own work, but rather to be another vehicle in which we conduct and perform our work. Nevertheless, we would like audiences to understand who we are, what we've been up against, and what we've been doing. And so we hope that Critical Notices number 1 and in the coming editions of this series that we will be able to address that and sufficiently answer questions and really explain ourselves much better than we've been able to up until now. Thank you.